Tēnā koutou, nau mai, haere mai. Hello everyone, welcome to the Walking the Shadowlands podcast. Let me be your guide as we take a walk into the realms of the unexplained, of the paranormal, of things that go bump in the night and haunt your dreams.
Your hosts,
I'm Marianne. Thanks so much for joining me today, tonight, whatever time it is, wherever you're living in this beautiful world of ours. Sit back, relax. Let me be your guide as we walk into the Shadowlands together and see what awaits us there. You're welcome. If this is your first time at Walking the Shadowlands, thanks for choosing to listen to us. Reincarnation, transmitigation of the soul, rebirth, metempsychosis, samsara, transanimation, or past lives are now, for the most part, mainstream in all the media and, at the very least, known by most peoples worldwide. In order to understand reincarnation, it's necessary to have at least the understanding, or some would say belief, that this body we currently inhabit is not who we are, that we are all spiritual beings having a human experience, that this body we use is a bit like a car that we drive that takes us from one place to another to experience something, to work on something, or to learn something. That once that car is all worn out and or no longer functional for our needs, then that vehicle is discarded and we obtain another one and another one. For most of us, though, we don't give that old car more than a passing thought, if indeed we remember it at all, because our current car has all our focus and attention. It serves our current needs and purposes. However, sometimes our past lives, for whatever reason, bleed through into our present ones, whether that's in the form of a very strong draw to a specific culture or time period, whether that's due to flashbacks in the forms of dreams or waking visions, or whether that is in the form of extreme phobias that have no origin in this reality. When this happens, it can impact our day-to-day lives here, sometimes, as in the case of severe phobias, crippling us even. Today's guest works specifically in the area of helping people to come to terms with phobias and past life memory bleed-throughs in the form of past life regression therapy. He uses hypnosis to help unblock and release these traumas. So, are you willing to walk with me into this part of the Shadowlands and see what awaits us there? Then let's begin. Simon Garfield Brown has a diploma in clinical hypnotherapy with the UK National Council for Hypnotherapy. He's certified in past life regression therapy with the Past Life Awakening Institute and is a member of the International Practitioners of Holistic Medicine. He has a fascination with the idea that consciousness is not a product of the physical brain, but exists apart from it, and the brain acts as some kind of receiver of consciousness, perhaps like a radio is the receiver of a radio signal. Simon started reading books on the paranormal before he was in high school. He's always loved to learn about ghosts, UFOs, mediumship, and any other subject that was supernatural. His interest then moved to the evidence of the afterlife when he read Dr. Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. He became more focused on the evidence side of the subject matter. He took part in his first past life regression in 1987 at the College of Psychic Studies in London. This had a profound effect on him and really started him on his life's work in past life regression therapy. Simon's had his own paranormal experiences, including psychic flashes, UFO sightings, and a number of strange events not easily explained. He's also a podcaster and has produced well over 100 podcast episodes. When not working, he has many interests, including playing bass guitar for over 35 years and writing science fiction stories. My guest is Simon Garfield Brown. Simon, thank you very much for joining us today. Since I came across you, I've been really interested in talking with you about the topics that you cover, about your work as a hypnotherapist. Perhaps you could tell my listeners what it is precisely that you do and how you got into your work.
Well, I just specialize in past life regression now. And I do a session, if somebody wants to just do exploration, which is what I wanted to do, then we do that. But I do past life regression therapy, which can be really effective. But I've always had an interest in paranormal, supernatural stuff. And that kind of led me through to going to the College of Psychic Studies in London in the 80s. And that wasn't that I was a student, but they would teach mediumship and all sorts of things like clairvoyance and channeling and past life regression, I suppose. And I went there regularly, and I'd pay to see a medium or a student medium. And one of the things I did was a past life regression, and it was really effective and really powerful. And so that kind of led me on later to study to be a clinical hypnotherapist myself. And it was quite an extensive course that I did over 10 months. But going back to the 80s when I did that past life regression, it was very interesting to suddenly find yourself almost in this different body and having this different viewpoint, and also the emotions that come through. And in a way, you can almost feel the clothes that you're wearing as well. So it did stand out to me quite a lot. And also, mediums would say to me, because I've been visiting mediums for ages, I don't have any talent in that direction myself, but they'd say to me, "Oh, later in your life, you're going to become a healer." And I thought, no, I can't see that happening. But, here I am. But did I become a hypnotherapist because they said that, or did they genuinely see something, a premonition of the future for me?
That's a good
You
question.
just don't know.
Mm.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
one of the things I love about the past life regression and other things that I cover in my podcast is this kind of verification that you might get. People do go into past life regression and see past lives and are able to prove that those past lives are real. Just like with near-death experiences, people will see things while they're having their experience, and they can later verify that, they saw this thing, and the doctors might say, yeah, but you were dead, you couldn't have seen that. And they said, no, I traveled down the hospital corridor and I saw this thing happening. And
Right.
so when I did this past life regression, straight away, the first thing I saw was that I was a little girl, about 6 years old, in a park in North London. And for some reason, I just knew it was 1895. And I was playing on the grass, and I could see a mother there and a man who was the father. And I knew that my little brother was in this pram that the woman was pushing, and there was a dog running around. And it was a pretty weird park. It was on a really steep slope. And, if you were a town planner and you were putting an area together, you wouldn't look at this slope and think, that's where we'll put the park. That's a good place to have it. But it was a couple of years later, I went into this part of North London. I'd never been there before. And there was the park on this really steep slope. And it was almost exactly as I saw it. And all the houses around the park in the area were exactly those houses that I saw in this past life regression. Because part of it, I was outside the house and going through the front door. And so I could see what they were like. And that, was some kind of powerful verification for me that this past life could be real. And another thing was the man that was my father. I just somehow knew that I know him in this life, and my best friend in this life was my father in my past life, that previous life.
And they do say, sorry to interrupt, for listeners who may be listening and are unaware, it's very common for people to reincarnate with people they knew from past lives in various ways. Like in Simon's case, his father is now his best friend, and yet in a life prior to that, his father might have been his brother.
Yeah. There's these connections, and this leads through to work that was started by Michael Newton, where he would take people into the space between lives, and you would see there are groups of souls that work together life after life to help each other, if you have to learn some kind of a lesson. But with that past life, I saw that person that I think I might have been. I'm still pretty skeptical of everything I look at, and I'm like, you've got to keep an open mind, but don't throw everything analytical and logical out, and just accept everything. But I went on to see that life as a nurse in the First World War in France.
Oh, wow.
And looking after all these soldiers. And that was, say, 1987. I did that past life regression. And then I did another one, like I've done others since then, but I did another one recently, just a couple of years ago. And I went back to that life again. But I was much older, and I was living in London, and I was married, and I was with this man that was really quite domineering. And he had this kind of attitude, woman's place is in the home. You do the cooking and the cleaning. And I remember it was so weird in this past life regression that I got really angry. It was like he was treating me like I was just pathetic and useless and weak. And I was thinking about that time in France, those months, and all these soldiers coming in from the front line with maybe their legs missing and their arm blown off and all this, and the franticness and the running around and looking after those soldiers, and this feeling of, looking at this husband in this past life regression and thinking to myself, you don't know me. You don't know what I'm capable of. You don't know how strong I am. You don't know what I had to do in the war when we were looking after all those soldiers. And it's one of the things that comes up in past life regression is the emotion. And you might say people are just imagining it or fantasizing or something. But I don't see that the emotion can be so powerful if you're just making it up, because, we all daydream about all sorts of things, but you don't get that intensity. And so I see this when I take people through past life regressions. Occasionally people can get really tearful and the emotions can be really powerful. And in some ways that's where you can do the therapy, because there's a great emotional release and energy release. And it's like you're connected to a past life that's bringing through something that's negative, has a negative impact in this life. And you can have a cathartic release of this negative energy and you can break that connection to the previous life.
Right.
So, yeah, go on.
Sorry, that actually brings me to a point that I was just writing down. With the way you found that you were treated as a woman in that life, has that influenced the way you treat women in this life, do you think?
I don't think so. I think my whole life I've been, when I was smaller, I think, something my mum said, he was a very sensitive boy, is what she said. And I don't know if you would say it's part of being empathetic.
Yes, yes.
And that I was never brought up to be this kind of tough guy male who would treat women badly. I've always been I don't know. It's just like my wife. I've known her since I was 15.
Wow.
We've been together for so many years, but still today, every day, we're worried about each other and hoping that the other one's okay and looking after each other. And I've been like that my whole life. And I've always, I suppose, treated people around me like that. And I don't know if that makes me, how I fell into being a hypnotherapist, a kind of trying to help people. Because I keep my prices low because I want to make it available to as many people as possible.
Right.
So I don't think that did affect me. I've seen other past lives, and which have made they kind of open your mind to things that you wouldn't have experienced. Because it's like I was saying, in that past life where I saw myself as a nurse in the First World War, I remember there was a scene that I saw where soldiers were coming into this huge tent and it was lit with gaslight lamps, and there could have been 20 beds either side, not beds like camp beds, and all these men that were hurt, and I was rushing around trying to help them. And I was wearing this nurse's uniform, and there were these long skirts to the ground, and I remember feeling this kind of, it was like frustration and anger of sort of, why do we have to wear these long skirts? And, as a man who's never, dresses like that, that was some kind of insight that I've never had before. And it was interesting that what I felt was not just like I'm realizing it now. It was almost a feeling of I've had this frustration and anger for months or years. It was like an old thing that would come over me. So and there was another time, another past life regression, where I saw myself as a woman in Italy, about 30 years old, and it was her wedding, and she was wearing this wedding dress, and it was almost like I could feel it. And it was in the 17th century, and it was very tight around the torso and then flared around the legs. And it's like if you tapped your knuckles against the torso, it made a hard knocking sound.
Oh, wow, the corsets, right.
And I could really feel that tightness and that how hard it was, even though I was lying back in a comfy chair while I was being taken through it. And so there's some more insight there, and to these feelings that I've never had before, and I would never have thought of being, the life I've had.
Right. I guess the point that I was trying to make is that because of how you were treated in that life where you saw yourself as the nurse, you came through into this life with those qualities of compassion, of empathy. You brought that with you, is what I'm saying, and it's affected you your whole life in the way you treat other people generally.
Yeah, and there's a thought I've had. I've because it's been so many years that I've been reading these books and I've been looking into these things, and I've produced now 169 podcast episodes, and each one's an hour-long interview, and just about every guest has published a book, and I read the books to work out which questions I'm going to ask. So I've read that many books as well, and there's this idea that maybe souls are being created constantly, that they weren't all created at one point. And so you have young souls and you have old souls, and this idea that the younger souls, they've only lived one or two lives, and when you reincarnate through hundreds of lives, you'll live life as male and female, as in different parts of the world, different ethnicities, and you may be gay or straight, and all these different lives. And because you experience being picked on and bullied for perhaps the color of your skin or your sexuality, when you incarnate in later lives, it's almost like that's in the background. You know what it's like to be treated that badly because of that thing.
Right.
So you won't treat people like that.
Right.
And it's so when I see somebody who's nasty and bully and is selfish and arrogant, I think that's a young soul. They don't understand. They haven't experienced it from the other side. They don't know what it's like to be treated like that. Anyway, it's just a theory I had.
Yeah, that's a really interesting theory. I'm not entirely sure that I agree with the young soul, old soul thing. I'm not pointing at you specifically, because people can use that to stigmatize others. You know what I mean? And in the greater spiritual community, it's often used to put people down. Oh, he's just behaving like that because he's a young soul, or she's unevolved, so she needs to do more growing. I'm not saying that's in your case. I'm just saying that's my perspective on it. But having said that, certainly we come into each life learning different lessons, and we don't always recall, well, most of us don't recall past lives. Sometimes we have spontaneous recollection. Before we had this interview, I told you about one, but there's another one that I haven't told you about that actually involved another person. And this was a gentleman that I had been speaking with for some time. We met in the days when there were forums, and I'm an artist. I sculpt and I paint and I do stuff like that. And I'd met him in this art forum, and we got very, very close over a period of time. Then one day I don't know what I was doing, and all of a sudden I had this clear as vision in my mind of him and I together in a past life. We were native peoples in a particular land, I won't say which land, and we were due to have been married, and I saw him being killed. He was shot by an arrow right above his chest, and I just knew that he had a birthmark there where he was shot. So the next time I was, and it really shook me, because this, like, just came out of the blue, out of nowhere. And so next time we spoke, I said to him, hey, Jay, do you have this? This is a really strange question, I know, but do you have a birthmark above your heart that's kind of shaped like this and about this far, above your nipple? And he said, oh my God, how did you know that? How did you know that? How could you have known that? And so I explained to him what I saw and what I had experienced and what I remembered. And yeah, so long story short, we got married sometime later, and and we talked about that quite often.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating thing, because Dr. Ian Stevenson did a lot of research into children with past life memories. And I've got one of his books. It's called Where Reincarnation and Biology Interact. And that's the whole thing of that book. That's all that book is about. It's all these children with these birthmarks and deformities. And, it's like that that thing, that boy would remember a past life where he was murdered, and that Ian Stevenson was able to get hold of the autopsy report from the
Yes.
previous life and see the wounds are exactly the same as the birthmarks. And there's a girl who remembers being a Japanese soldier that was captured in Burma and tied to a tree and executed. And she's got these deformities on her arms that look just like rope marks from being tied up. And then there's a boy who remembers being an American bomber pilot flying over Burma and getting shot down. And if you see a picture of him now, he's this boy. I mean, ethnically, he's Burmese, but he has white skin and blonde hair and blue eyes. And, that's interesting how this stuff comes through from past lives.
Very interesting.
And there's also experimental things. They call them experimental birthmarks, where in certain cultures, they'll mark the body after somebody's died. And then when the baby's born nearby, they check the baby to see if they've got that mark on them so they can see if this person's reincarnated.
Oh,
And
that's
sometimes
very interesting.
they do a mark on the back of the neck, just underneath the hairline and other places. So, so these, it's well documented and been researched for years.
And actually, I did an episode on reincarnation in my very first season of the podcast. This is season 8 that we're in now. And I actually covered that chap, and I had some photos of his work on that episode's page of my podcast website, www.walkingtheshadowlands.com. So if listeners, if you want to go on there, it's just simply titled Reincarnation. You can actually find a link to this gentleman and his work. It's really very interesting. There are photographs, as Simon talked about, showing the birthmarks of these children and conforming marks on the bodies of the people he was able to find, and photographs of them, of their wounds and stuff like that. Very, very interesting. Now, in your research, Simon, in your experiences, have you come across many, from recent tragedies, like, for example, 9/11? When I did the episode on reincarnation, I actually only focused on children because that's just kind of the way it worked out. But children, mostly children who were people who had died during the 9/11 incident. And many of these children recall falling or recall being trapped or recall hearing a bomb going off.
Yeah, I talked to, now I think it's Carol Bowman is the lady I talked to about this. I'm like 90% sure. And she was contacted because she's a great researcher. She's got a couple of great books out on children with past life memories. And she was contacted by a family whose little boy kind of remembered being a firefighter.
That's right, yes.
At 9/11. And they think they tracked down the family and the firefighter, but she said they haven't contacted the family because they didn't want to, cause any problems with grief. And if the family really does not like the idea of reincarnation, they didn't want to cause any trouble.
Right.
But what the boy was saying was very, there was a lot of detail there. There's no way this boy could have known this stuff. And that's one of the things that's so fascinating about this. And, the work by Ian Stevenson is being continued by more other people. And he was at the University of Virginia. They have a place there called the Division of Perceptual Studies. And it's now Dr. Jim Tucker who's running that side of the research. But they also research near-death experiences there. And I just happen to be interviewing Jim Tucker tomorrow night for my podcast.
Oh, brilliant.
So he's got a book out because he's written 2 books previously about children with past lives. And he's gone into a lot of detail with the children, and it shows how much these kids remember and how much of it is verified. So it's not just a couple of small things, but they've put both his books into one big book now. So he's so... that's how I'm able to get him on the podcast because, he's promoting his book.
Yeah.
It's a good way to get people on the podcast. And so it's going to be fascinating to talk to him about it. But there's some really good researchers out there who are looking into this. And it's just amazing how it's not kind of mainstream, that not many people really know about it and know how much information these children bring through that's verified.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's not just this little snippet, like, and very often kids spontaneously remember past lives for a period, and then as they get older, they no longer remember them. But it's not just little snippets with these children that we're talking about. It's verifiable information. Like I had the one about the kid that was the fireman as well on my show, because that was so impressive, and there was so much detail that he brought forth from the people he worked with, their nicknames, where the station was, the new fire engine or something they had just got. All of these were absolutely verifiable information. And so it's not just little things like a child saying, "Oh, you used to be my mummy." It's verifiable stuff. And very often it's in families that people don't even believe in this or have never heard of it.
It's like the James Leninger case in America that Jim Tucker wrote about. He investigated that with Carol Bowman, and the boy went into so much detail about his life as a pilot in the Second World War. And he talked about the type of plane he flew. And his father, like his parents were Christians, and the mother was much more accepting of the possibility of reincarnation. But the father just was against it so much. And he wanted to prove it was nonsense. But the more he investigated it, the more he was, confused and frustrated, because the more he found of it was true. And there was even a point they gave the boy a model of the actual aircraft that he said he flew. And the boy said something like, "Oh, they've left the aerial off. There was an aerial that used to stick out the side of the aircraft. People were always walking into it." And later on, that the father took the boy to the like the meeting of all these people, these veterans who were on the aircraft carrier that he flew on. And he mentioned this aircraft, and spontaneously one of the guys said, "Oh yeah, they had an aerial sticking out the side, we were always walking into it." And it's the thing with, how could this 4-year-old boy know about that? They weren't even putting the aerials on the model aircraft. So, the boy couldn't have learnt about it in this life by seeing that somewhere.
And it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? Yeah.
And I think they took him to a theatre show that was a kind of music and dance from the 40s. And somebody came on stage dressed as the president, and the little boy is 4 years old going, "Oh, that man's an idiot," talking about the president. And it was strange how he had such a strong opinion of this character,
Right. Oh, that's so interesting. Now, the information I guess that's why I focused on children more than adults, because children aren't, for the most part, it's not stuff that they would have picked up elsewhere. Like this kid that was the fighter pilot, there's no way that as a 4-year-old he could have known that, or even understood what he was reading if he read it somewhere enough to be able to talk about it knowledgeably. And didn't he also recall the names of some of the people he worked with?
Yeah, he was. His name was James Houston in the previous life. When he was very small, he would draw pictures of aircraft, like fighter aircraft, because he would fly a very small bomber, a one-man aircraft, and he would always draw it crashing, and then he'd sign it James 3. And his parents would say, "Why are you signing it James 3?" And he said, "Well, I'm the third James." And they didn't quite know what that was. But then they found out in the previous life his name was James. And, they'd named him James in this life. And in the previous life, the father was called James. So in this life, that made him the third James.
Very, very interesting.
But he had so much interesting detail there, where he said that he was flying, I think he said Mustangs was a fighter plane. But on the aircraft carrier, they didn't have Mustangs, and they think he's just making a mistake. But when
Right.
they did a lot more research into this pilot's life, they found that before he was stationed on an aircraft carrier, he was a test pilot for these certain type of Mustang fighter planes. There's no way this little boy could have known that. And he said they had a problem with the Mustangs, that the tires would always blow up when they were landing.
Oh,
And
wow.
after even more in-depth research, he found out this was true. That's why he was a test pilot on this prototype of this Mustang. One of the problems they had was that tires would blow up when they came back down to land. So
Whoa.
they eventually tracked down they call him the previous personality, the last life. They
Right.
tracked down the previous personality's sister, who was an old woman, and she sat down and talked with the little boy, and she said afterwards that, she said, I don't really believe in reincarnation. I'm a Christian, but I just can't deny there's something here. Something of my brother has come through in this little boy,
Oh, wow.
because he had, information about the family that
Hmm.
nobody would know about the abusive father and being a drunk and leaving them. And she said, we never told anybody about that. We're too embarrassed. We don't tell people that's what our family was like when we were small.
Wow. Wow. And that's must have actually in a way been very healing for that woman to know that, well, her brother still exists in some way or form, even though
Yeah,
there must have been a bit of a dissonance for her, like dealing with her Christian beliefs and this young chap in front of her giving her details. That must have been difficult for her to reconcile on one hand, and yet very not encouraging, very comforting on another hand.
yeah. And I think that it's like it's comforting to all of us in a way, I suppose, because there is something that can be verified. It's like you can look up the documents and the
Mm,
facts and figures and find
mm,
that these things are true. And it's not like some kind of religious faith that you believe in the afterlife, when actually there isn't actually that kind of proof like you would get with these children or with near-death experiences. And with
right.
other, things where with mediumship and deathbed visions and all these other things that come up. And that's sort of what my podcast is about, is trying to look at this evidence for the afterlife. So it's not at all from a religious point of view. It's all if there are facts and figures. But what it's done has really led me down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Whereas when I started off, I'm just looking for these verifiable near-death experiences in these children. And then it leads you on to stuff. And it might have been when I started the podcast, I might hear about some spiritual thing, something a medium would say or
Mm,
something. And I think, oh, that's just too far for me. That's too crazy.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
but now, after these years of studying it and looking at it and having my own experiences, you think this isn't crazy. But also, in a way, it kind of clamps me down, because I've gone down this rabbit hole by myself, and nobody in my family has, and none of my friends have. And so I think I can't talk to people about this anymore. They'll think I'm mad.
Yeah.
But I had a guest on the show, a medium called Claire Broad. Do you cover mediumship on your podcast?
Not generally. I don't give mediums. Well, I am one myself, but I generally don't have mediums on the show because there's lots of shows out there that do that. So I just really stick to experiences that people have had generally.
Right. This is one of my experiences. So I was talking to her about she did a book with another woman about angels and angels
Right.
communicating. And for me, that was a bit too far. This is crazy, this stuff with angels. And the people who've had near-death experiences would talk about seeing angels. And I'd say to them, okay, well, what did they look like? Because if you say to me angels, I imagine huge wings and playing a harp and wearing a white robe.
Right.
But they said no, they're just like some kind of energetic being. They might just be an intense ball of light, or a kind of like a light being, a human shaped light. But they saw them as angels. And so what they would do is they'd say that you might they might indicate to you that you've had a visit by an angel because they leave a feather. And I was thinking about this the day after I talked to this medium. And just at that exact point, I was thinking about that. A white feather floated out of the sky in front of me.
Oh, wow. That's really
And
interesting.
So I looked at that and I thought, that's just a coincidence. So a few weeks later, I interviewed the woman, the co-author that she wrote the book with. And I was saying, I had this experience where I was thinking about the angel and this white feather floated down, and she kind of laughed. And I finished the interview and I went downstairs, and there in the middle of my teenage daughter's bedroom was a feather on the floor. And the carpet was completely clear. It wasn't like a teenager's bedroom that's got junk everywhere.
Yeah.
And the feather was like this long. And I asked my daughter where it come from, and she was like, I don't know. I found out later it was her feather. She'd had it, for a while, but she hadn't placed it right in the center of the room. So that as soon as I come through the door, there it is, really obvious in front of me.
Right.
And so there was two things there about feathers, and they both just at that point where I'm talking about or thinking about angels leaving you a sign by leaving you a feather. So then I go, this before COVID, I go and see a medium, and she is friends with the Claire Broad, the first medium that I talked to about angels and feathers. But before I sat with her, she didn't know who I was. She didn't know anything about the podcast. I just gave my first name. And she did an hour of mediumship, and she was really good. She just came up with so much stuff that was correct.
Right.
And afterwards I said, well, I got your number from your friend Claire Broad, and I do this podcast, and I was talking about angels, and I was talking about these feathers. And she says, well, look down. What? And I looked down, and there was a white feather on the floor in between us. And I'd been sitting opposite her for an hour, and that white feather was not there during that hour because the carpet was really nice and hoovered, completely clean. And I really was, stumped then. It's one of those times where your brain comes to a full stop and you just think, I just can't explain where that feather came from.
Yeah.
And so it's like in physical mediumship, when something appears, they call it an apport, don't they?
Yeah.
And so I was just thinking that must be what's happened. Because I mean, maybe the feather was stuck to the bottom of my shoe when I walked in and it fell off at a certain point, but it wasn't that close to me.
Yeah.
And so, when you have experiences, they can really mean a lot to you, and you explain them to someone else, and they can kind of be skeptical and talk it away. But 3 times now, feathers have turned up when I'm talking about angels, leaving signs, leaving feathers for me or for anybody, when they want to make their presence known.
Right.
And it's like one compounded on the other, which multiplied the feelings of the next one. And that's just one of my kind of experiences that makes me really wonder about this stuff. And I try and keep an open mind, but there's a saying I like, which is keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that too.
Yeah.
And it's good to keep an open mind, and it's also good to question as well. Like I always say to people, you can listen to what I have to tell you. You can listen to it, but you should always question. Never just accept things at face value, even from me, even from anybody. You should always question it and see how it fits with you. How does it feel? How does it resonate in your soul? How does it make you feel when you think about it? Do you feel good? Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel at ease? Like it's really important to question. But when things like that happen, it does make you question automatically, doesn't it? You question what your beliefs are. You question how did this happen? And most people go through, like you did, all the logical things. Did I bring it on my shoe? Did I before you can accept that this might not be actually a physical thing, even though there's a feather physically here. People back in the olden times used to live by signs and synchronicities. That was how they lived, more than people these days do. We've lost a bit of our connection that we used to have with spirit, if you like, with the way that spirit or the unseen realms let us know that they're around.
Yeah, there's all sorts of little signs, and I've talked to mediums about this and other people, and it's almost frustrating in a way. If they are, spirits can do apports and they can leave signs, why are they so subtle? Why can't they just, be a bit more obvious about it all and leave us something that, just write the
Like a
lottery
sledge.
numbers on a bit of paper and leave it
Yeah,
out for us somewhere?
yeah, yeah. But apports, like talking about the feather appearing, aren't always subtle. I did a paranormal investigation with a team that I run some time ago, and we were sitting in this hall, and all of a sudden there was this loud bang, and it was incredibly loud, and there were 5 of us in the room. We all looked around and said, what the was that? It was so loud. And then we heard this bang, and then we heard this dunk, 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 dunk. Turned the lights on, and it was a little bit of dog food, a little bit of dried dog biscuit that had come out of nowhere, made this terrific noise, louder than it should be for the size of it. And that's the first time I've ever experienced an apport, but it certainly wasn't subtle. It was like really, really loud in your face. So
And did it scare you, or did you feel excited? Like, yes, I've actually seen something.
excited because, I had never, in all my years, I've never experienced an apport before. And I had heard that they can be quite noisy. But, I'd never mentioned anything to my team because it's not something that had ever come up until this happened. So it was we were all very excited, but that was a very active place. That's another story. But yeah,
Yeah.
they aren't always subtle, but most of the time they are. And you have to be aware of I guess you have to be aware of yourself and your own feelings as well to
Yeah.
sometimes recognize what's going on.
Yeah, because there's this idea that the energy that the people doing the investigation produce can have an effect, can't it?
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
like the physical mediumship. When you at one of those seances, they get everybody to sing a song and to be really upbeat and to bring in a positive energy. And I talked to there's a lady that looks after a physical medium called Stuart Alexander in the UK. And he's getting, I think he's 73, 74 now.
Oh, wow.
And he's really good, but she is a kind of what you might call the gatekeeper. You don't get into one of his seances unless she says so.
Right.
And you have a conversation with her about why you would like to sit with a physical medium, and how, if you're really skeptical, because they don't mind you being skeptical, but they don't want you to try and sneak recording devices in or to suddenly jump up and interrupt it all. But I interviewed Leslie Kane. She wrote a book called Surviving Death, and Netflix based a series on her book.
Right.
And she's in the series as well. And she's been a guest a couple of times. And she sat with Stuart Alexander at one of his seances, and she saw some amazing stuff. And I've talked to him about it as well, because he was a guest on the podcast. And she talks about how she sat opposite him, and there was a table on the floor with a glass top, and there was a red light on under the table, because they keep it very dark in these physical seances. And he was sitting on a chair opposite her with his cable ties around his arms, holding his arms to the chair, cable ties around his ankles. So he couldn't have leant forward and done any kind of magic tricks.
Right.
But this, they call it ectoplasm. She says it came as a mist over the side of the table, and that it was lit from underneath by this red light, and the mist coalesced and formed a human hand. And she heard a voice say something like, well, aren't you going to shake my hand? And she leant forward and she held it and shook hands with this hand. And she said it felt just like a human hand, just a little cold maybe. And it just kind of fell apart back into the mist and disappeared back over the table. And, you know, it's almost like it's real magic, like Harry Potter's real and magic's being done.
Right.
But there's all these other things that happen in these physical seances. And they used to happen like 100 years ago, 120 years ago. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would investigate, and it was the Society for Psychical Research. And I thought that all kind of died out 100 years ago, but there are still physical mediums about doing these things, and these apports happen, and these voices are heard, and these trumpets, you know, about what they call the trumpets that float around the room.
Yeah. I have a lot of issue with that as a medium myself, because there are so many fakes out there that prey on vulnerable people. So I'm always really skeptical, despite my knowing about stuff like that, because of the fakery and the trickery and the people that have given genuine mediums a bad name. And that's one of the reasons I don't have mediums on my show, because I don't know them. And I'm not going to promote anybody that I don't know is genuine. You know what I mean? Because there's so much trickery out there that anybody can say anything. And I've read all that stuff. And I know that he and Houdini went around debunking most of these frauds. Some they couldn't. Some they genuinely couldn't, but they were very rare and far between.
Yeah, there was a medium who, in the Second World War, she would have voices in the room. And this young man came through and said that he was on a British warship that had been sunk.
Right.
And she, I think she talked about it, and she was arrested.
That's right.
The government had said, this is top secret. We do not release this information. You must be a German spy. And they prosecuted her in the end using an act of parliament. I think it was the 1753 Witchcraft Act.
Yeah, that's right.
That's where she went to prison for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And later she was in Scotland in the 50s doing a seance, and the police raided the seance. And because she was a physical mediumship, and they talk about the energy you've got to have in the room. She died about a few months, maybe a year later. And there's some people are suggesting that it's the police that damaged her when they raided it. It caused such a bad energy. I don't know about that. That's just something I've heard, but that's a suggestion. But it's fascinating that she had that information about the warship sinking.
Yes.
And it was top secret. There's no way she could have known that.
I remember reading about that, and I remember thinking, poor woman, how awful. It's really just another witch hunt, isn't it? You know, because like I know for myself in my own personal life, I've had people come to me. I had a friend come to me because she knew I was a medium, and a friend of hers had, and I'm not sure if I'll keep this in the show or not, a friend of hers had passed, had disappeared in very strange circumstances. And she said, can you please try and find out what's happened to her? Well, anyway, she came to me and she showed me what had happened to her. And I saw that she had been murdered. And I saw where her body was laying, the position it was laying in. And I noticed that, like, she had one shoe on, one shoe off, the way her body was lying. And I noticed there was something in her mouth, but I couldn't make out what was in her mouth. And so I contacted the friend and I said, look, I'm really sorry, but I'm pretty sure that your friend has passed. And I wouldn't say that to any other person. It was just because I knew this lady. And, you know, I could always be wrong. I'm human, you know, and so things have to filter through my own knowing. So I don't like to get involved in stuff like this because I don't want to cause pain to people. And I said, look, she's shown me where she is. I don't know the area that you live in at all, but I'm shown that you go down this road and there's lots of forest around. Not native forest, it's pine or something like that, that's been planted. It's man-planted, non-natural forest. We do logging here in New Zealand. It's one of our major exports, so it's one of those forests. And you go out of this particular city, and you go, like, you're heading towards this way, and there's this on this side, and then there's a road to the left, and you go down that road, and she's off on the right, just off the road behind a pile of gravel. I think I said gravel. And she said, can you let the police know? And I said, look, hon, the police aren't going to listen to me. They're not going to pay any attention to what I say. They'll laugh at me. They'll think I'm, full of, caca. And anyway, so I said, because she was so distraught, I said, look, okay, I will, but I'm telling you now, this is how they'll respond. And of course, that was how they responded. They just laughed at me and hung up the phone. 2 days later, she was found exactly where I said she was, in the position I saw her, and what was in her mouth was her ear.
Oh.
Yeah. So,
yeah, that's amazing. Did the police come back to you and think you're a suspect because you knew where the body was?
No, they didn't pay any attention to what I said. They just laughed at me and hung up the phone.
Yeah.
I'm just another kook. I'm just an attention seeking, and so I just don't do that anymore after that. That was the first and only time I've done that. I've had people ask me, but I just won't, because it's distressing to me because I tend to feel what the victim feels or what the person feels when I'm doing readings. I tend to feel, or if somebody comes in that's passed, I feel how they passed. Like if they passed with a stroke, I'll get a headache or a pain on the side of the head that they had their stroke on the side, stuff like that. So it's just too stressful. And there's always the possibility that I could be wrong. And it's the human side of me that holds me back from doing this, because I don't want to cause pain to people. That's not what I'm about. But, it can be very... I guess where I was going was this, the energy. You were talking about the energies. It takes a lot of energy for me to do stuff like that. Even just when I'm talking to people like this and spirit will come through, that takes a heck of a lot of energy. And I'm 65 now. The older I get, the less my body bounces back. It can take me a couple of days to get over it. So when you're talking about physical mediums who can produce stuff like that, I'm actually, and I don't generally say this, I'm a full transfigurational medium, which means that if I allowed spirit, they could alter my appearance and take on the appearance of another, of themselves, so and that's only ever happened to me once, and it was spontaneously when I was doing a reading for this couple that were there with me, and the woman's aunt just was there in front of my face, and all I could see was blurry, and I thought, oh, my eyes have gone all blurry. All of a sudden she gasped and screamed and burst out crying. I thought, oh my God, did I say something wrong? I didn't know what had happened, because it actually hadn't. I don't allow spirit to do that. I don't allow spirit to use my body, because it's just my control. I just won't allow anybody to use my body without my permission. And that was the first and only time that happened. And once it happened, I said, no. But she said to me, I said, when she calmed down and stopped crying, she said, I just saw my aunt as clear as day. You weren't there. Your face wasn't there. It was her looking at me, talking to me. And the energy, and this is a roundabout way of saying that the energy that a person, when they're a physical medium, exudes, it can be physically damaging to them to have, like, you should never touch somebody who is in this process, who's doing something like that, because it interrupts the energy, and it can cause disruption to the electrical system in their body. So it can cause things, like heart palpitations or stuff like that. If you've got any issues, it can enhance that because it interrupts the electrical signals in your body, and we're all energy, we're all electrical beings pretty much. So that's why it's dangerous. That was a really roundabout way of saying that. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that it can be very damaging to mediums. But anyway, let's get back to your work, because we really did go off the beaten path there. In your work as a clinical hypnotherapist, is there something that's consistently that you've seen with all the past life regressions that you've done?
I always take people into the past life, but we never know which life they're going to see. And the idea is that it be your higher self, your spirit guides that would choose the past life for you to see. What I suppose is interesting is that almost every time the people see a life that's not really that interesting, not that exciting, can be quite mundane, but at the same time, they get a lot of insight out of it, and it can be really helpful for their current life.
Right.
So it's only been a couple of times somebody's gone to something really traumatic. And what I do is always we go through the death of the past life, which is something we do very easily. And, you know, I think only maybe twice somebody's had a traumatic death. Almost always they say they're just old and they're in a bed and they just drift away.
Right.
And part of the hypnosis there is that I say to them, we're going to do this. We're going to go through this past life death with detachment and with peace and with just enough connection to understand what's happening. So there's no pain there, no physical pain, no emotional pain. And most of the time they say, you know, it's I just drifted away and I feel this sense of relief. And now I'm quite glad to be away from that old body. And then we go into this afterlife space where I would invite the spirit guide to come forward and we can ask them some questions. And quite often they do come forward, and then we can ask all sorts of things like, why have you incarnated in this life? And the spirit guide say, well, you're here to learn this lesson. And we say, are you on the right path? And why did you show us that previous life? How's it connected to this life? So I've got maybe 20, 30 questions that we can ask.
Right.
And then also I ask the client to give me questions. If they've got something specific they'd like to ask the spirit guide before we start, I say, let me write this down so I've got it ready to go when we get to that point. And, you know, it's interesting how the spirit guides turn up and they show themselves. Usually they show themselves as a person, not somebody that the people would recognize.
Right.
A couple of times I've had it that I had a woman whose son had died the year before, and she was in this past life where she was in the kitchen and she was cooking dinner for the family, and it was Victorian era. And she said, oh, my brother's just walked in the room. And I said, it was the brother of the past life. She said, no, my current life brother who died, he's just come in and he's just come here. He's just come to tell me that he's okay. And there was another time we were in that afterlife space after we'd gone through the past life death. And the woman said, my grandmother's here. She's just come to say hello. And there's this spontaneous, you know, imagery of these people coming in. And, you know, we never know if that's going to happen. You can't guarantee that would happen. It'd be great if you could offer that as a service, you know. But also, I've had a couple of people who've gone to peculiar past lives.
I was just going to ask you about that. Sorry to interrupt. In your work, have you ever talking about? Oh, maybe go ahead. Maybe that will answer the question I have.
Well, this woman said she was in a desert, and it was very rough. There were lots of rocks on the ground, but it was a desert. And one of the things we do straight away is to try and get them grounded into that life, is to say, you know, what are you wearing? If you look down, can you see what you're wearing? And she said, well, I'm naked. And then she was quiet for a while. And it was kind of like she was embarrassed to say, but she said, I don't think I've got a human body. I've got too many knees. That my legs have got two sets of knees. And I tried to ask her more about that, but we couldn't really find out any more about that life. And one thing about this is, hypnosis is the power of suggestion.
Right.
So the questions I ask have to be really basic. I can't suggest anything.
Yeah.
But there was another life. This woman said she was hiding in a cave and she was really scared, and she was saying, they're coming to get me. But what she said was coming to get her. She said, they're like rats, but they're human sized and they're intelligent. And I'm hiding in this cave and I'm not human. I don't know what this body is. So that sounded like another weird past life on another planet. So, this stuff is, could indicate, there's no way you could prove it, but there are lives on other planets. And there was also a woman I interviewed. She's got a book called The Dual Soul Connection.
Oh, that's Susie.
Where, she talks about having this previous life as a grey alien, one of the greys that does the abductions, and how in this life she calls it the dual soul connection, because it's like she's got her grey alien soul in this life as much as a human soul. But I suppose you can't say a soul's a human soul. It's just a soul, and it might incarnate on any planet as anything.
Yeah.
So that, those are interesting things that have cropped up. And so you asked for consistencies, and I went completely the other direction.
That's actually the question that I was going to ask you. So, something just said, shut up, Marianne, and let him talk, because he's going in the direction you were going to ask. So, yeah, there you go. I was going to ask, have you ever come across cases during your work where people have lived in other realities and other planets?
Yeah, I mean, I've had experiences myself where it was kind of like a water planet. It seems like I was something like a dolphin, and the whole planet was just water.
That's Sirius B.
And when I was asked about it, it was my response was that this is a place where souls come for rest. You incarnate here as a rest time, a rest space, before you go back to some awful planet like the Earth.
Well, Earth is a prison planet. It is a prison planet. It's definitely a place of polarity here for sure. So, in all your work, what is it that you've learnt the most about what you've done? What sticks with you the most?
I'm not sure. Because I've been interested in this for such a long time and read so many books about it. It's almost like what I come across when I'm doing past life regressions. I'm aware of it, and I know, these things can crop up, and there's sometimes some spontaneous things. I suppose what I learned from it is that people can get such great healing from such mundane lives. And that we can break the connection between the lives. It's like your subconscious is bringing through these connections. And we can say during the hypnosis, talk to the subconscious and say, you're doing such a great job and you're so good at this, but there's this one thing that you're bringing through that's not helping. Do you mind not doing it? And the subconscious will say, yeah, that's it, I'll stop. And I've had it where I've said, okay, subconscious, do you agree to not bring this through anymore? And the client's gone, yes. And then afterwards, after I've taken them out of the hypnosis, they say, I don't know where that yes came from. I didn't say that. It just kind of sprung up out of me. Like it really was their subconscious that was talking and agreeing to it. So it's amazing when those things happen.
It's very interesting. Do you find that, like for me personally in my life, one thing that I've learned with my past life recollections is that the past belongs in the past. Like a lot of people want to find out about past lives because they're curious, and just because they want to know that they've had them. And I always say to people, well, if you need to know about a past life, not just because you're curious, but if it has an impact on your life now, then you'll find out about it in one way or another, whether it's through dreams, whether it's through spontaneous recollections, or for example, phobias. a lot of people, myself included, have phobias that they've brought that are related to past lives. Have you come across that?
Yeah, people come to me and say they have this feeling, this phobia or this emotion, and they don't know the source of it, and they might have felt like this their whole life. And that's one of the things that people will come to me to kind of do an exploration. It's not like they're desperate for therapy, and it's one of the things that I look for, because I do a free consultation call before we do the session, and I'll ask them, do you feel like you've been pushed to do this, as though your spirit guides are behind you and they're poking you in the back saying, go and do this past life regression. And sometimes they feel like that there's some kind of inspiration, some kind of drive to do it. And so that you can see where maybe these things crop up. I did a session for a woman in Russia, and her brother-in-law listened to my podcast and suggested to her that she talk to me, because she's had this feeling of guilt her whole life and she can't explain it. And we went through to these 3 past lives where there were circumstances, like she saw a life where she was a doctor and she was called to this house. This woman had just given birth, and as a doctor, they knew that the baby would not survive. And they felt terribly guilty because I'm a doctor, I should be able to help here. And then there was another past life where she was an old woman in bed and she was dying, and there was a teenage girl sitting next to the bed, and she knew that the parents were gone, and this old woman was the only person to look after this teenage girl. So she knew when she died, she was on her deathbed, the girl would be orphaned. And so these things made them feel tremendously guilty in their past lives. And it was like this guilt was being brought through to this life, and she didn't know the source of it. And after we finished the regression, she looked so confused and bewildered. And she said, I don't know what just happened to me, because she had no interest in reincarnation and past lives. And, she'd just done it because her brother-in-law had suggested it might help. So this connection to these lives showing this guilt was amazing. And she said she felt lighter afterwards, like something had been lifted off her shoulders, and that's where some of the therapy can come into it. But usually what I like to do is 3 hypnotic sessions, and they get more intense as we go through. And that's where we get into the release of all the energies and breaking the connections to the past lives.
Right. And do you, does that also help you build the connection with your clients so that they trust you? The first session might be, the client might be a little bit uncomfortable or uneasy or not exactly sure what's going on. So it gives them a chance to relax into the process as well.
Yeah, but the 3 sessions are structured like that. So the first one's a kind of an introduction where we're not really trying to be therapeutic. So you learn what it's like to be hypnotized, and you learn what it's like to view a past life. And it's being set up that way. And as it gets more intense as you go along, it's kind of like you can handle it because you know where you are and what you're doing. And also I do all the sessions on Zoom. The clients are at home. They're in their own space. They're not in some strange room with some strange man. And I feel they can relax much more, because they know if they wanted to, they could just cut the connection on Zoom and they're in their own place. And the thing about hypnosis is sometimes people afterwards say to me, I don't think I was hypnotized. But to me, it was obvious they were hypnotized. And I think what they were expecting hypnosis to be and what it actually is are 2 different things. You're in complete control the whole time and you remember everything. But at the same time, I record every session. So I send an MP3 out after the session. So the person, it gives them the opportunity to relax during the hypnosis, and they don't have to worry about whether or not they'll remember this or that, because they'll have the recording.
That's really interesting. I never thought about you being able to do that via Zoom. I always thought about hypnosis as being an in-person thing. So, of course you can, but it just never occurred to me that you could. And of course, with the world situation as it is, as we stand at the moment with COVID, it's the only way you can work.
Yeah. And because the podcast is worldwide,
Mm.
I've had clients, most of my clients are from America, but occasionally it's Australia and New Zealand. And I've had clients from Sweden and Norway and, just everywhere. And it's amazing how it works so well over Zoom.
Yeah.
And I think it's a kind of an energetic thing. I think mediumship works well over Zoom as well,
Yeah,
because
you're right.
it's not about the physical thing of being with somebody. It's about the energy and the connection.
You're absolutely correct on that. And there is there's no distance with energy. Energy is like like I've had clients in America, I've had clients in England, like yourself, and you don't have to physically be with a person to be able to feel that energy and that connection. You're absolutely correct on that. Have you ever had any clients that you could not hypnotize, that for whatever reason you couldn't hypnotize?
Yeah, it's I can think of two out of all this. I've done a lot of sessions, and I think that it was a kind with one of them, it was a thing they had never done it before, and they were very kind of anxious about it. But the thing was, they were coming to me for therapy to help them with their anxiety. So it was, it was a kind of
Double-edged sword.
self-perpetuating thing.
Right.
So the first session, it didn't work out, but the second session did. And it was just the thing where she was just getting used to it. And the second time, the guy, he kind of, he said, look, I just can't relax at the moment. I just can't get into it. And it's like, okay, fair enough. And if it's like that, I reschedule the session with them. And, I have this policy, if somebody cancels within 24 hours, then they forfeit the fee.
Yeah.
But with situations like that, I say, well, okay, we'll just rebook it, and I won't charge them again. We'll have another go at it.
Yeah, that's fair. It's fair call. Because, people would come to you with all sorts of, anxieties, and people with trust issues too. It must be difficult for them to be able to relax and put themselves in the hands of somebody they don't know, because they don't know what's going to happen. So I could see that could make it difficult for people to relax. But only two, that's out of all the people that you've seen, and you've doubtless seen hundreds, that's not bad, really.
I think that just about all my clients listen to the podcast, and that's how they know about me and what I do. So a lot of them say that they already know my voice, and there may be a trust thing there, because if they hear me talking so much over 160 something episodes, it's almost like you get an idea of what the person's like.
I agree with that. And there's a familiarity there, because you're in their home with them, on the podcast. You're with them when they're jogging or when they're driving. So there definitely is kind of a familiarity, and you don't feel like a stranger to them, because you've been a part of their lives while they're doing whatever it is that they're doing. So you're right. So there's a trust there. I actually hadn't thought about that until just now. But yeah, people do trust you. They get to know you. They get to know your personality. And listening to your podcast would certainly, the way you talk to people, the way you interact with your guests, would certainly give them an idea of your personality for a start, and it would let them know that they could trust you. So I could see why it wouldn't be hard to hypnotize somebody who's got to know you like that, because there is that, as you say, that trust there. Now, what got you into podcasting? What led you to that path?
It's because I was listening to a lot of podcasts. I used to have a day job. I used to work in an office years ago, and it was quite a long way away. It was 60 miles. So I would commute on the motorway. It would take an hour and 15 minutes to get there, an hour and 15. So it was 2.5 hours every day, 5 days a week. And so I didn't particularly like the radio. I didn't like the DJs. I didn't like the adverts. I didn't like the music. So I started listening to podcasts, and I was searching out all these different ones that would talk about paranormal stuff and supernatural and UFOs. And after a while, I realized that some of them had guests that I was really interested in, but then sometimes there were guests I wasn't interested in. And I thought I couldn't find a podcast that did what I did. And I'm sure they're out there. I just couldn't find them. So I've been a musician for it's 40 years now. And just a moment. Here's one of my things right here.
That's a nice guitar.
I've got one here next to the desk. I've got one next to the bed. I've got one next to the TV downstairs. I'm always picking up and playing, and it's been 40 years. And over that time, I've done so much recording, whether it's in studios or at home. And that's quite a big undertaking to do a whole band and to get it all right. And I thought, well, recording a voice is going to be a piece of cake. It's just talking to a microphone. I've already got all the software. I already know how to do it. And so I thought I'll make the podcast that I want to hear because I can't find it. And so it was like I set myself that task and I researched it all and put it together. But it's I don't think I quite did it right because you do seasons and I've never done seasons. I just every single week for 169 weeks, I released a 1-hour episode and did all the research and the recording and the editing. And so recently I've taken a break, and so I'm just getting back to it now after 4 or 5 weeks.
Oh my goodness, you would have needed it. Look, when I first started my podcast, I did it weekly as well, and I did it all myself. I edited it and I transcribed each episode because right from the start for me, it's important that deaf people could have access to the podcast. Even if they can't hear it, they can read it. Because I operate on a shoestring, I can't afford transcription, and the ones that are online that do it, the computer ones, even the best ones, they're only maybe 80% accurate, less in my case, because the Kiwi accent, they always can't understand what I'm saying, so I end up rewriting it myself anyway because of all the errors in it. So I found it really hard because for my episodes, I like you read the book, which is a lot of work, a lot of hours, that's research. And I'm the same, like for each episode, particularly for episodes where it's a subject that I don't know, I'll do 10 to 30 hours research on that episode alone. And then I write it up, and then I present it. But it's a lot of work. So kudos to you because I know how much work goes into this.
Doing the research is quite good because you're reading a book about something you're really interested in. So that's quite good.
Yes, I love it too. What do you have lined up? Are you going to continue to do them weekly? And are you going to take breaks every so often so you don't burn yourself out?
Well, what I'm going to do is record them in chunks and do. So I've got 5 lined up that are going to be recorded over the next 7 days, and then so that'll be 5 weeks worth. So it'll take me 2 weeks to do research and recording and editing. I've decided to do it that way, and it's like the first guy I'm recording tomorrow night is Dr. Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia as Children's Past Lives, and then I'm talking to a woman called Deborah Corbell, and she was the subject of a book in the 90s that was quite successful called Intruders, which was about alien abduction. But she says that her and her sister were abducted many, many times throughout their lives, and that things would happen around that as well. Mm-hmm. She had poltergeist activity in her house. Things would move around. So it's a thing where it's not just alien abduction, and the people who claim that have been abducted by aliens have the same after effects that people who've had near-death experience. So it's, like synchronicities, psychic events. They can't wear wristwatches because they just won't work. So all sorts of stuff like that. And Then I'm talking to Linda Kramer. She's a medium. I've already did an episode with her. She's great. And I'm talking to a guy called Richard Martini, who's in the States, and he's in the movie business, and he's had a couple of friends who are film stars, and they've come through a medium after they've died. Is Bill Paxton and somebody else, and he's done so much stuff, and he's got so many books out and documentaries and things. And there's somebody else. There's so many people. I'm just going to get it on the screen here. And Rob Gentile as well. He had a near-death experience, and so I'll be talking to him about his near-death experience. So they're the first 5 episodes coming up for the new my new season, and I'm not sure if I will do seasons or I'll see how it goes. Do 5 weeks and have almost like 5 weeks off before I do the next 5, or something like that. I'll see how it goes.
Well, even if you only took 2 or 3 weeks, that's a break for you. But it's not really a break because you're still sourcing guests, you're still lining up people. So it's still work behind the scenes, but it's a little less work, eh?
Yeah.
I want to go back to your lady that you were just talking about, the one who said about the watches, the UFO abductee. Now, I've been in experience of my entire life, and it's something that I do talk about on the show. And I just want to verify what she says, what she'll talk to about watches is my nurse's fob watch. I was a nurse for most of my working life. Honestly, fob watches are that's the nurses' watches that dangle on a chain that we in the British health system and in New Zealand and Australia, the nurses wear watches that hang from their chest, so it's easy for taking pulses and stuff like that. My fob watches would last maybe 2 weeks and then they would die. And these weren't digital ones, these were wind-up ones. And if you didn't have a fob watch, which is part of your uniform, you would be, like in trouble. And it cost me a small fortune in watches because they would only last a couple of weeks. And I initially was buying really expensive, good quality ones because I wanted them to last. But I actually never wore watches until I went nursing, so I didn't know that it was, that I would affect them like that. Yeah, so that's by the by. So that's something you could tell your lady when you're talking to her.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And also, I've interviewed a couple of nurses on the podcast, and it seems like it's nurses are on the front line will see things that may be supernatural. The doctors won't see it so much, and the doctors seem to be much more materialist and don't believe in all this nonsense. But nurses will see things, and I talked to a woman called Dr. Penny Sartori, and she got a PhD in studying near-death experiences, but she was a nurse for 17 years. And she said that her first night when she was a nurse, they said to her, "Oh, we think such and such in this bed over here is going to die tonight or maybe tomorrow," because she's talking to her dead husband. He's coming to visit her. And she thought, "Oh, okay, I'm the new guy. They're taking the mickey at me. This is a joke. It's not really happening." But then she realized that, that this person they were having a conversation with somebody that wasn't there. And there's that phenomenon of deathbed visions. And there's another woman that I'm hoping to interview soon. She's got a book out called Ghosts of the NHS. And she talks about how occasionally in this one hospital, the patients would say to her, "Oh, I had that nurse visit me again last night. Why is she wearing that uniform from the 1950s?" And she said all the nurses in the hospital knew about this ghostly nurse. And she was so comforting and so friendly. It was never like a scary apparition. And also it wasn't like it was a transparent ghost. It was as though she was really there. She was an actual physical person that would visit. So it's always interesting how it's the nurses that are aware of all this stuff, and it's the doctors who, think it's all just nonsense.
The nurses are hands-on. The doctors generally are just they're not hands-on, except for they're there to diagnose and to give medication. They don't do hands-on in New Zealand and the British health system. It was a bit different when I was in the States. My husband, then Jay, had an operation, and he had a nasogastric tube in, and the doctors actually aspirated it. They'd come and I've never seen in all my nursing career, I'd never seen a doctor do something like that. That was a regular nursing care. So, but generally speaking, that it's nurses that do the hands-on stuff. So the nurses are there all the time, and I had an experience myself. I used to work permanent night shifts in this Roman Catholic hospital. It was run by the nuns in Auckland, and I was on this shift in the sluice room. And the sluice room is where you empty the bedpans and all the soiled linen goes and stuff like that. And because the machines that you clean the bedpans out with, and we didn't use disposable bedpans, they were ones that were put in a sterilizer, put in a sterilizer. So, you had to clean the bedpans, particularly if the person had gone number twos. So you had to clean the bedpans out before you put them in the sterilizer, otherwise they came out a caked mess. And I was cleaning, it was about 2 or 3 in the morning. I was facing the sluice room. The door to the sluice room was on my left, and it was shut, and I was really aware of the noise I was making, because noise travels at night, and it's really hard not to make noise in a sluice room. It's just impossible, but you try to minimize it as much as you can. And I was cleaning this, and out of the corner of my eye, to my left, I saw this nun standing there, and I thought, oh, because they lived above the hospital, and sometimes at night, if they couldn't sleep, they'd come around and visit the staff and just make sure that we were okay. And I saw this nun standing there, and she had the long black robe on, the black hair, and she had the white bit around her face and under her chin. I don't know what they're called. And she was standing there with her hands like this, looking at me, not in prayer, just like at her chest level, just holding them like that. And I thought, oh, she looked really upset. And I thought, am I making too much noise? She's going to rip into me when I finish this. And I acknowledged her, and I turned back to what I was doing. And then I turned around I finished, and I turned around to face her, and she wasn't there. There was nobody there. But I saw her very clearly. I could see the colour of her eyes, the way the folds of her robe were, and her disapproving look at me. And honestly, it gave me such a fright, because and then I thought about it, and I thought, well, I didn't hear anybody come in the door. It was a swinging door. I didn't hear the door shut, which, quite possibly I could have missed over the sound of the sluice. But yeah, that was quite an interesting experience. But as far as patients go, yes, I've seen that so many times myself. And many nurses also kind of have this instinct. They have a way of knowing when a person is going to turn or they're going to pass. Like, for example, some nurses know that a person's going to die. One nurse that we had on our ward, she would know, because their nose would go cold, and she'd know that they only had like half an hour or so to live. And that was the way she knew, before anybody else knew. Didn't matter how well they were, how ill they were. If their nose was cold, that was her sign they were going to pass, and sure enough, they did. And just little things like that, little instinctual things that nurses, notice. Yeah, I think that lady, what's her name that goes to the NHS? I'd love to talk to her. She sounds brilliant.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just quickly check. I think her name is Glynis Amy Allen.
Glynis.
And
Amy Allen.
She's working now. She's retired as a nurse, and she's a medium.
Wow, that would be really interesting, because I love her stories like that. So
it's called Ghosts of the NHS. That's the name of the book.
Simon, it sounds like you've got some really interesting stuff coming up for your guests. How can people contact you?
The Website is pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. And it's kind of dual website. Part of it has got the podcast on it and all the episodes, and the other part of the website is all about the hypnosis and doing past life regression, either just to explore and see what happens or for therapy. And there's a booking page there, so people can just go in and book a time and date that suits them to do a free consultation call, and it's 20 minutes. And we can just talk about what it is they want to do. And if they book that, I'll send them an intake form, and they've put loads of information in there so I can read that before we do the consultation call. And that saves a lot of time because we don't have to go over, all the basics and what have you.
And I'm sure that there are heaps of people who are listening and who would be interested in actually having a session, whether it's just to satisfy their own curiosity or to find out what it's like, or for help. Do you have many people who actually come to you just out of curiosity, or do they always come to you with a specific intent in mind?
I'd say it's about 50-50.
Right.
There's a lot of people who listen to the podcast, and I think they're really interested in this stuff. And so, because currently I charge $99 for a session, that's US dollars. And I think that's quite cheap compared to a lot of other people.
That's very cheap.
And so they can come and just do an hour and we'll just see what crops up. And sometimes it's beneficial. Sometimes the spirit guides, if they choose a life for you, which would be really beneficial to view right now. So something might come up that makes sense, that can give you insight into something that's happening in your current life. And other times we just see some interesting lives, and people do seem to get a lot out of it, even if they didn't think they'd get that much out of it to begin with. It's a thing. I think the spirit guides, I almost feel like when I'm doing the consultation call before the proper session, the spirit guides are listening on the call. And it's almost, I say to the client, as much as you're telling me what you want to do, you're telling the spirit guides what you want to do as well.
Very interesting. And so are you on social media as well? Do you have a social Instagram, Twitter?
Instagram is the Past Lives Podcast with an underscore between each word. And on Twitter, it's at Simon G. Bown. And my surname is spelled Bown. And so that I'm on those two. And there's a Facebook group. It's a private group. And that's the Past Lives Podcast. And I kept it a private group so that people could go on there. And if they had something personal to say about this, they could say it and it wouldn't go on their normal Facebook feed. Because occasionally people do put things in there that I think they don't want their family to hear about or their friends.
I totally understand that. But people can join, and I presume you have questions that they have to answer before that.
Yeah. Just about, privacy and don't swear and don't be rude and, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally get that. So where do you see yourself going now? Do you feel like you might branch out in some other direction with your work? Oh, here's a question. Have you ever done a hypnosis session where during that session you've had unusual phenomenon happen while you're doing the session?
No, I haven't. And I wonder if that's because, I'm not a medium. I never had any of that kind of talent. So I don't know if it's just, you could say that you can move the veil to one side or open up a channel in some way. I don't think that I can do that. I have had psychic flashes where I've seen things, but it's not like I've ever had any control over it.
What about another question, kind of a follow-on from, but have you ever had clients that you've hypnotized that have had spirit attachment to them?
The guy that I did the training with for past life regression therapy, he does spirit attachment kind of therapy. and he teaches how to do it. But I haven't had a client with that. But he does do a course in that, and I was thinking of doing it because maybe has been somebody with it, but I don't know how to recognize it.
I think it would be obvious, you'd know, like often people, and spirit attachment isn't as common as people think it is either. It's not like, there can be spirit around us in our energies, but it doesn't mean they're attached to us. That's quite a different thing. But I wonder if maybe that spirit's way of, because they just said to me just a minute ago, ask him that question. So maybe it's a way of getting you to think, oh yeah, maybe I need to do this.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm going to get some people who are in that situation.
Because when I talked to him about it, he was saying there's 3 different ways that he works with it. And I found it interesting. He said one of these attachments is with ETs. And he said it's kind of like they've put a device on the person.
Great.
But it's not a physical device that we would see. It might be what you might call the astral plane, that there's a device. And he goes into the hypnosis and he asks the person, say, can you bring this ET forward now? And can we communicate with them? And they're very polite and say, would you mind removing this device from this person? And the ET will say, oh, okay. And then they'll take it off. And it's a weird idea to me, that these ETs are in the astral plane. They're not physical, or they can choose to move between the astral plane and our physical plane.
There are ETs that are interdimensional as well as extraterrestrial. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I've always thought. But I had a guest on who, she talked about how she woke up one night and there were 4 ETs at the bottom of her bed, and she got out of her bed and she was standing there and she didn't really feel that fearful. And then she thought, I feel really odd. And she looked around at the bed and she could see her body still in the bed. She was having an out of body experience. And as soon as she realized that, she snapped back into her body and woke up and looked up, and the ETs weren't there. But she was saying it was absolutely real. There was no way it was a dream. And also that gave her the idea that these ETs were in the astral plane where she was when she was out of her body. And so I had this kind of thing where she talked about it, and this guy who does spirit attachment therapy talking about it. And there's a kind of confirmation there that that idea that happens.
Very interesting.
And I once heard about a guy who had an out-of-body experience, and he went way up into space, and he came across this craft. And while he was having the out-of-body experience around all the humans on Earth, nobody could see him. But when he went on board the craft, these greys looked round at him and were kind of like, hey, how did you get here? What do you think you're doing?
Yeah.
So, it's just interesting. I think there's people who think UFOs are just metal ships, maybe like Star Trek, and they travel through space. But there's a lot more going on there to do with reincarnation and spiritual matters.
There is, absolutely. Those are, I can absolutely 100% verify what you just said. And I talk about it in various of my podcasts. I've talked about my knowing and my understanding. And the thing that you say about ETs being the astral body, they have technology where they can remove our spirits from our physical body without our permission.
Yeah.
So not all abduction scenarios are physical. Quite often they are, like that lady said, she was out of her body and she saw them at the foot of her bed. And then she realized she was out of her body. That's not uncommon in the least. Yeah, not uncommon at all.
Yeah, because I have read about a couple of people talking about their abductions, and one of them was partially blind and they needed really powerful glasses. But when they were with the ETs, they didn't have their glasses on, but their sight was just fine. And somebody else was saying that they have a limp because their leg was damaged. But when they were with the ETs, they were walking normally. And so there was that idea that actually they weren't in their bodies. They were abducted some other way, which is really creepy, actually.
Yeah.
There's something else. If I just tell you about this thing quickly, I I did a past life regression, and we went through the death of the past life, and the hypnotherapist was saying to me, okay, just drift away. You're going up high now, you're into the clouds, just drift away. Just tell me the first thing you see. And then I was suddenly terrified. And it was like somebody had flicked a switch. I went 0 to 100%. And she said afterwards she could see I was shaking, and I felt like my muscles in my legs and my back and my arms had turned to jelly, and it was all quivering. I was so scared.
Oh.
And I was lying on this table. There were these greys around me, and they were doing something to me in this abduction experience. And then all of these weird other things happened through this experience. And at the end of it, I found myself back in the flat I used to live in West London. And then I got up the next morning, went to work like nothing had happened. But it was weird because I went to see her for a past life regression. There was no talk of trying to regress back to an abduction experience or looking for aliens at all. It was all about past lives. And this thing kind of spontaneously sprung up. And I've had other people, guests on the podcast, who've had ET experiences. And I've asked them about it, because for me, it's almost like that wasn't real. I don't know where it came from, but I don't believe it actually happened to me. But they've said, no, I've done so much research into this. I think it probably is something of a reality.
I think it probably did happen to you, or else why would you spontaneously have that recollection? Most people who have abduction experiences don't recall them at all. Some only have flashes of them. And I would also venture to suspect that that's not the only time in your life that that's happened. I would suspect that it's been an ongoing thing over your youth, and perhaps on a subconscious level, this helped push you into this area because you wanted to know more, you wanted to find out about all this stuff.
And being on a spiritual path in a way.
Absolutely.
Because I have had a couple of close-up UFO sightings, and one of them, there was a craft just maybe 50 feet off the ground. It didn't move an inch the whole time I saw it, and it was completely silent. And I knew enough about alien abduction to check the clock when I got home to see if there was missing time, but there wasn't any missing time.
There isn't always, though. You know why? Because they can manipulate time. Time doesn't exist outside of this reality. So even if you are taken onto a craft and you could be there for days, minutes could have passed here in this reality.
Yeah, and it's interesting because people with near-death experiences will talk about being away for such a long time, but actually it was only a few seconds on Earth.
Yeah, exactly.
But I did talk to one guy, a researcher, and he said to me that they might have just been showing themselves to you. They say you're not going to see a UFO unless they want you to see them. And they might have parked their UFO there as a kind of, as he said it, they're slapping you on the ass. They're saying, hey, pay attention.
So as validation for your experience that you had. So, yeah, I was quite certain that I am quite certain that you've had more than that one experience, and seeing UFOs, the times that you've seen them, is a validation for me of that, because he's right. They don't show themselves unless there's a reason for it, like, as clear and as long as that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to see one again, or many of them again. I just don't want to wake up in the middle of the night and find one at the end of the bed.
That's the fear thing, eh? But you can, very interesting. And how does this feel now when you're talking about this now? How does it make you feel?
I feel quite excited in a way, because I've talked to people and I've listened to a lot of interviews, people where it's almost like it starts out, it's terrifying and they're afraid of this. But over the years and the decades of repeated abductions, it's almost like they become friends and they look forward to it.
A bit of the Stockholm Syndrome, you reckon. But it's not always abductions. Sometimes I've never been an abductee. I've been an experiencer my entire life. There's a difference. Abductees are people who are taken against their will, without their knowledge generally. and they only, might have snippets of memories, but the experiences are usually quite terrifying and quite horrific. And they're usually conducted by species that have little regard for humanity. So it's very terrifying. Experiences, on the other hand, while initially it may be a bit scary because it's out of our paradigm of reality that we know about, you soon realize that there's nothing to fear and that you have a bond with these beings. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something spiritual to it, and it's all kind of connected.
It's very connected.
I see the connections
Yeah.
with the past life memories for children and near-death experiences, and then things with ETs and the synchronicities and things that crop up. And it's almost like there's a big jigsaw, and we've just got a few of the pieces, and we're just getting some idea of what the picture is.
Correct. Oh, Simon, that is so awesome. And I can see that. I can see the path that it's leading you down. It's going to be a really interesting time for you coming up. And the fact that you're open enough to talk about it and to share that you actually had that ET experience, that kudos to you, because that's hard to do, especially when you're a public figure. So I want to acknowledge that, and I know that we're in for some very interesting times coming up. And I actually believe that you might come across more and more of this aspect in your work.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what crops up. If people contact me who are potential guests, and they have books or they have experiences. So I'm always open to people contacting me.
No, I meant in your hypnosis work and with your clients.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, no, I meant with your clients, yeah.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah.
And maybe there'd be spontaneous things cropping up like that happened with me.
Very interesting. Oh, look, Simon, it's been awesome talking with you. Sorry, I'm going to have a fair bit of editing to do to put this in a cohesive, so it flows, because I've gone all over the place, and that's my fault, and I apologize for that, but you're just so interesting. Thank you so much, Simon. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I'm sure that my listeners will find this conversation as interesting as I have. So thank you very much for your time today over there in England. I appreciate it immensely.
That's fine. It's been really enjoyable. It's been great talking to you.
I want to thank Simon for his time and interesting conversation that went to places I never anticipated. Past life regression, spontaneous ones, all with a facilitator like Simon, can have a real impact on our lives here and now, especially if we have brought phobias or issues into this life from a previous existence. In my opinion, unless a past life is causing issues in this one, as in the case of phobias, and except for curiosity, there's really no reason to know about them. Past lives are generally past for a reason. That life has been lived, lessons learned, you should move on. And on the off chance you do have recollections of past lives and people in them, even if you reconnect with a loved one from that existence, it doesn't mean that they should or necessarily do have a part in your life this time around. Different life, different lessons. At least that's my viewpoint from personal experiences with past life loved ones encounters. You, of course, may have a different viewpoint, and that's how it should be. This will be the last episode for this year and for Season 8, a shorter season than normal. 2021 has been an interesting year for sure. I'll be taking a break until the 11th of January next year. The past couple of years of creating this podcast have taught me that very few people tune in for episodes over this time of year, with most off on holidays at the beach, here in New Zealand anyway, or visiting family. So I've decided to have a break. Honestly, I need a rest. It's a lot of work for me doing this podcast, pretty much a full-time job. I absolutely love it though, so I'm not complaining. You all are not forgotten though, and you can always listen to past episodes that you may not have heard. I'll post some suggestions up on social media during the break. Coming up when we return in Season 9, I already have 4 episodes lined up for you. I'll give you previews of those closer to the time. In the meantime, for those of you who celebrate this season, I wish you all season's greetings, and everyone, please be safe and aware on the roads, at the beach, wherever you travel over this holiday season. And I'll see you all next season. Be safe, everyone, and have a great break. And thank you all for listening to my Walking the Shadowlands podcast. I really appreciate each and every one of you listeners. Today's bumper music was called Reborn by Music Dog. If you enjoy this podcast and have considered becoming a sponsor, now's a great time to join. Just head over to patreon.com/MCC15 and sign up now. As a patron, you get early access to the podcast episodes and a special members-only page on the podcast website that has bits and pieces that end up on the digital cutting board, and little extras like full, raw, unedited video conversations with my guests, except, of course, for the ones that request privacy and anonymity, EVPs caught during the conversations, and so much more. Also, you can download full written transcripts of each episode, and you get my absolute appreciation and gratitude, patreon.com/MCC15, for just the cost of a cup of coffee a month. So you don't miss out on an episode, make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcasting platform. This podcast is available on all free podcasting platforms, including iHeartRadio and Pandora as well. Also, if you have Alexa, simply say these 4 words, "Open Walking the Shadowlands," and Alexa will play our latest episode for you. Check out our Facebook page, Walking the Shadowlands, our Instagram feed of the same name, and our Twitter feed at Shadowlands10, TikTok under walking_the_Shadowlands. Like and follow for teasers of our upcoming episodes. If you don't have a smartphone, then you can listen to the episodes from the podcast website, www.walkingtheshadowlands.com. For those hearing impaired, there's a full written transcript of each episode on the website, so you don't miss out at all. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your workmates about our show. Encourage them to listen and to subscribe also. The more, the merrier. Thank you so much for listening. Today, tonight, whatever time it is, wherever you're living in this beautiful world of ours. I'll see you after this season's break. See you then.
Thanks for listening.